I want to talk about forest monitoring from the user view. And if you talk about forest monitoring in Pacific Island countries, we have to distinguish between two main types. We have volcanic islands like Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and we have atoll islands. And both have different needs and different conditions. Volcanic islands, there are most of them still stocked with rainforest. You have to observe the mangrove. Very important part are forest plantations and very little coconut, where you have coconut wild grow, which is considered as forest after the FAO guidelines. The atoll islands, coconut is important, then followed by mangroves. And you also have, a lot of people don't know, little forest patches. However, atoll islands have a monitoring scale of 1 to 10,000. And Copernicus data at the moment are not that suitable. Whereas volcanic islands with a monitoring scale of 1 to 50,000, Copernicus data really could increase the use. Next slide. An example of an atoll island, in this case Kiribati, monitoring is essential. You see here a comparison between old historical vegetation map, which was produced from aerial photographs recorded in 1969. And you see that the mangrove cover is surprisingly growing. And this is in most islands of Kiribati, partly in islands of Tuvalu. A lot of people don't know. It is essential to observe the countries. Next slide. Forest mapping in Fiji, as one of the volcanic islands, has in the meantime quite a history. 1991, I came to the Pacific to conduct the first nationwide forest inventory, where forest mapping was part of it. At this time, we had to utilize a relay satellite. A lot of people don't know that most Pacific, that the complete Pacific is outside a footprint of any ground receiving station. So when people say, let's get historical Landsat data, this is very nice, but it doesn't apply for Pacific Island countries. The first real data at 1 to 50,000 scale was the SPOT program, and then followed by Landsat 8, or in this case, Landsat 4, which could relay to a relay satellite, which downloads the data in Goddard Space Flight Center in the United States. But not many countries activated relay satellites. So the data coverage of the past is extremely limited. During the first mapping, we also put our effort into map the country. At this time, we could buy quarter scenes. At this time, Landsat you have to purchase, was not that cheap. But within a 2 years window, we didn't manage to cover Fiji cloud-free. And this applies to many other Pacific Island volcanic islands, that you have an extreme cloud cover. Third challenge was the atmospheric disturbance. Next slide. You have the problem that the air, which is traveling 1,000 kilometers, is very humid, and little clouds already in the little mountains already cause cloud building. And especially you have different atmospheric conditions of the lee and loof side of the mountains. At this time, we didn't have atmospheric correction. In the meantime, there are other potentials, but certain areas like Taveuni never was cloud-free within, or very, very few cases within a time window of 30 years. Taveuni is one of Fiji's island. Here, Sentinel-1 would help. It is a possibility to patch between visual or optical data little areas where you can analyze radar data. It sounds good. We have to have a radar analysis possibility in the Pacific. We had one at SBC, but it was not further supported. So the analysis of Sentinel data has to be established. Another thing where Copernicus really could help is the space data highway. If this is activated, it would allow us to better cover certain areas with optical data. Next slide. Just to say, to show the difficulties of forest monitoring in Fiji. The deforestation rate was estimated, I say estimated, it's never 100%, from 92, 2001 and 2007, where in 2007 we had ALOS data, optical data from Japan, because Landsat was not available, and then from 2007, 2012 and 2017. It was visual interpretation. In the beginning, the forest inventory 91 and also a forest inventory 2006 were run with automatic classification. But I mentioned already before, the atmospheric disturbance had major problems on an automatic classifier. All forest deforestation rate establishment faced a very low loss of forest area. And the forest area loss, you see the left arrow, is where the villages increase their agriculture area into the mountain. However, there is a lot of loss of timber. If you look at the arrow to the right, you see that we have image data over a heavy logging area. You see the yellow logging tracks, which have a high contrast to the surrounding forest. However, this contrast is only visible for a couple of months. Then these areas overgrown by forest, and the rest of the forest is still forest, although a lot of timber is extracted. We have selective logging, and with 1 to 50,000 data, Landsat, and I assume also Sentinel, it is very difficult to map these degraded areas. Forest degradation and deforestation are two different issues. And so far, it was essential to see the rate of the deforestation. Okay, nevertheless, forest degradation mapping is a must, not only in Fiji, also in Vanuatu and Samoa. Next slide. Just back, one important point, how we mapped. We had Google Earth display to assist the Landsat display. I must say 2017 We didn't manage to utilize Sentinel data because the data coverage for Pacific Islands was not that, that we had sufficient seen. Important is that we mapped, if you do a visual mapping, in a way that we adjusted the polygons always to the new period. It is not the case that we did a new mapping in every period. We adjusted the mapping. This reduces the statistical error within change detection process. The same applies, by the way, to automatic classification. You have a systematic error between the different classifications if you don't base on the old classification. Important was that the forestry department was involved. You see here Willy Tupua, and very experienced forester. I even know his father. And that we had immediate field checks. These are all things which are essential to come up with decent forest monitoring. You can't do forest monitoring from a remote place, Europe, US, or Australia. You have to know the condition and you have to be able to make permanent field checks. Next slide. Another approach was collect Earth. It's a visual interpretation and gives a statistical picture of the forest or of the deforestation. It was well performed in PNG. In Fiji, there were serious problems, but organizational problems. Solomon Islands and Vanuatu did also collect Earth approach with very little results. The other countries didn't want to have it, especially the low-lying islands. There is a possibility to utilize the sample areas as input to a digital classification, but then the classification runs on Landsat data, not even on Sentinel data, is something which would improve the map output. But for low-lying islands, these are data which give a picture of 1 to 50,000, not the required 1 to 10,000 mapping. Next slide. Forest degradation, I said it's very difficult to distinguish between logged and unlogged area. At least after 3 months, it is not visible. Here is a possibility to involve Sentinel data if there is a more frequent coverage. If it's possible to capture this 3 months where you see the logging tracks, then you can set this area to side. You know this is a degraded forest area. The GPS mapping would be another tool. In Fiji, it failed because the timber production officers who are present in the logging areas did not have enough GPS instruments. The logging tracks, I said, are an indicator. I go back to it. There is possibility not only with a frequent coverage of 3 times higher Sentinel data. There is also another possibility. And we have the possibility of indicator plants. Plants which indicate that a logging took place. Next slide. It is possible, or it would be possible. We tested, but it was only for a short time, where we established a radar analysis section within SPC, financed by GIZ. There is radar analysis possibility in Blue Jump Company in New Caledonia, but the rest, I don't know any radar analysis station in Pacific Island countries. If there is a higher coverage of radar scenes, it would be possible to have a scene-to-scene registration, and then little disturbance, like forest tracks, could be made visible, even if they are not visible with optical data. Next slide. Indicator plants we have in forms of African tulip. African tulip is an introduced species which grows where the forest is open. We have climber, which also only grows where forest canopy is open and where you have nearly overlogging. And we have tree ferns. Next slide. What looks promising? We have one article from Litia Novo, is the possibility to separate African tulip. African tulip luckily grows in small groups, has a long flowering season from May to nearly December. And it is also possible to separate by the spectral response of the leaves. The leaves are visible in the near infrared, nicely covered with Sentinel data, better than with the current Lancet program. It just requires a further investigation to enhance the possibility to map forest degradation. Next slide. A lot is talked about drones, and I show here a vertical lift-off drone, which can land in small cuttings within the forest. But here in Fiji, we have more than 800,000 natural forests to cover such an area. I have to switch my phone off here. With drones is very difficult. Drones have their application, but even in small island countries for forest monitoring, it is not the right tool. Often the cost to bring a team with a drone and with GPS system over is more expensive to buy high resolution image data, which is now with artificial intelligence available with 15 centimeter. So here, the dream of some forest and agriculture departments to do monitoring with drone has to be advised or has to be clarified. Next slide. We have every year Pacific GIS and remote sensing user, very important conference. There's always either on the second or third day a session of forestry, and there is a discussion session. These things like drone application has to be discussed between the companies, between the users, and between the scientists. Every year, last week of November, the conference takes place. Please come and visit. Next slide. Next slide. There's also the possibility to go into the PGRSC website. There is a newsletter which can be downloaded. And this newsletter tells a lot of stories about applying or conducting forest monitoring. So we don't have to invent the wheel. A lot of things are there. It's a pity that in the Pacific, a lot of knowledge got lost. Next slide. Thank you.